In the deep heart of Alabama, where the summers are heavy with heat and the air seems to hold secrets of its own, there once stood a house that locals whispered about long after its windows went dark. On the outside, it was everything the southern gentry prided themselves on. Columns white as bone, porches wide enough to welcome half a town, and a garden where magnolia trees bloomed like porcelain in the spring. Yet, for those who lived in the shadow of its grandeur, the house became less a home and more a mausoleum. Death seemed to live there, always waiting, always patient. Families came into the estate full of promise and pride, but generation after generation, their bloodlines ended not in old age, but in sickness, swift, cruel, and unexplainable. For years, the official story was that misfortune simply followed this family, as if cursed by fate itself. But in the hushed gossip of neighbors and the cautious whispers of surviving servants, another story lingered, one darker, one almost too terrible to believe. They spoke of a housemaid, a quiet woman who was always present, always dutiful, and yet somehow always standing just beyond suspicion. She served their meals, poured their tea, and tended their tables. And it was said that with each polite gesture, she was slowly feeding them to death. The poison she chose was common, even mundane, rat poison. In a time when vermin plagued every home and farms stored it like salt, no one thought twice about its presence. But in careful hands, it became invisible death, a killer that could stretch its work over days or weeks, cloaking murder as natural sickness. A cough, a fever, a sudden collapse. Families buried their dead, never imagining that their own dinner table had been the instrument of execution. Imagine the terror, not in the moment of death, but in the slow erosion of health. The patriarch struck by sudden stomach pains, the matron wasting away with a mysterious illness that doctors called consumption, children crying out in the night with burning throats. Each burial draped the estate in grief, yet life went on, because no one suspected that the person they trusted most, the one who folded their linens and prepared their food, was quietly dismantling their family tree. She worked in silence. No weapon flashed in the dark. No violent scene stained the floorboards. Her power was in patience. Unlike the killers who struck once in a rage, she wove death into the fabric of daily life, ensuring it would pass as misfortune rather than malice. This was not murder in a single act. It was murder disguised as loyalty, stretched across decades, erasing a bloodline one meal at a time. Even now, fragments of her story come to us not from the pages of court transcripts or official investigations, but from rumor, recollection, and the uneasy folklore of the South. The truth hides between fact and legend. Was she truly a servant driven to vengeance, a woman who exacted quiet justice on those who held power over her? Or was she merely a scapegoat for tragedies no one could explain? The mystery is part of what gives this story its power, because it leaves us trapped between two terrifying possibilities: that an entire family line was cursed by fate, or that a single woman, armed with nothing more than patience and poison, deliberately ended it. Picture the scene: dinner being served in the soft light of oil lamps, the silverware polished, the conversation of wealthy Southerners filling the air. And at the edge of the room, silent as always, the housemaid stands with folded hands, her eyes cast down. To the family, she was invisible, a fixture as ordinary as the chairs they sat on. Yet, with each passing course, she may have been deciding who would live and who would not. The Southern mansion was supposed to be a monument to survival, an image of wealth and continuity in a post-war world where fortunes had collapsed. Yet within its walls, survival became impossible. Sons never lived to raise heirs. Daughters never grew old enough to see their own children grow. The family line thinned until there was no one left to inherit the legacy. The estate that once stood as a symbol of permanence became an empty relic, its halls echoing with the memory of those who dined their way to death. There is a particular horror in the idea that one person could undo an entire dynasty without ever raising suspicion. That the most trusted hands in a household, the ones who cooked and cleaned, were the very instruments of destruction. And in the stillness of southern nights, with cicadas humming and the house looming in the dark, the legend of the housemaid grew into something almost supernatural. Some said she was not just a woman, but a curse in human form. sent to make sure that none of the family she served would survive her. Whether she was caught or whether she faded quietly into the background of history, we may never know. What remains is the story itself, a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with screams or bloodshed. Sometimes, it moves silently, spoonful by spoonful, until nothing remains but graves and unanswered questions. And as we step deeper into this tale, we are forced to confront not just the mystery of one woman, but the dark reality of a society built on servitude and silence, where vengeance could grow quietly in the shadow of silver trays and porcelain dishes. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Alabama, like much of the South, was a landscape of contradictions. The war had broken the backbone of the plantation economy, leaving once mighty families scrambling to preserve their wealth and their pride. The sprawling estates, with their grand white columns and wraparound porches, still stood like monuments to a past that was slipping away. Yet inside those walls, the air was heavy with tension. The masters and mistresses clung to their old way of life, while the people who worked in their homes, many of them formerly enslaved, lived in the shadow of deep resentment and unhealed wounds. It was a world built on appearances. Southern aristocracy wanted to present itself as civilized, genteel, and unshaken by the war. Women wore lace gloves to church, men told stories of honor, and family portraits were painted to capture their dignity. But beneath the surface, their world was unraveling. Money was scarce, fields lay barren, and diseases swept through towns already weakened by hunger. And in the middle of all this turmoil, the Southern household became a stage where power, loyalty, and quiet rebellion collided in dangerous ways. Domestic servants were at the heart of this fragile balance. For wealthy white families, hiring black women as housemaids was both necessity and tradition. These women cooked meals, laundered clothes, scrubbed floors, and raised children that were not their own. They were expected to be invisible, to work silently, blend into the background, and offer complete obedience. To the families they served, a housemaid was not just an employee, but a constant presence, a shadow who knew every weakness, every habit, and every secret. For the servants, though, life inside the big house was a double-edged sword. They were closer to luxury than most in their communities, but they were also trapped in a world that reminded them daily of inequality. Their work was endless, their pay small, and their dignity constantly tested. Every polite, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," carried with it layers of bitterness that could not be spoken aloud. Behind closed doors, they whispered to each other about the injustices they endured, the insults, the slaps, the constant suspicion that no matter how hard they worked, they were never more than tools in the eyes of their employers. It was in this environment that the housemaid in our story lived. She was one of thousands of black women in Alabama whose labor kept the illusion of Southern refinement alive. To her employers, she may have seemed ordinary, quiet, efficient, respectful. But the truth is that servants often saw and heard everything. They overheard private arguments between husbands and wives, watched drunken tempers flare, and knew which family members were weak, greedy, or cruel. In a household where appearances mattered more than honesty, the servant was often the only person who saw the family exactly as it was. Rat poison was everywhere in these homes. The Southern climate bred pests, rats, cockroaches, and mice that invaded kitchens and pantries. Households kept tins of poison tucked away like flour or sugar. Servants used it to protect the family's food stores, often sprinkling it in corners or mixing it into dough meant for traps. To most, it was just another chore. But for someone harboring resentment, it was an opportunity. Unlike knives or guns, poison left no scene of violence. It required no confrontation. And in a society where black servants were rarely believed over their white employers, suspicion was easily deflected elsewhere. The larger society reflected the same contradictions found in the house. Alabama was a place of deep racial tension. Reconstruction brought laws that were supposed to give freedom and rights to black citizens, but those laws were resisted fiercely. White supremacy reasserted itself through violence, intimidation, and systemic inequality. Lynching was not a distant fear, it was a real and ever-present threat. For a black woman in service, retaliation against a white family could mean her death if discovered. Yet at the same time, The imbalance of power created a dangerous temptation. The very system that forced her into servitude also placed her in the most intimate proximity to the people she might one day despise. That is what makes the story of the Alabama housemaid so haunting. She did not strike in anger with a weapon, as some desperate rebels had done before her. Instead, she moved with calculation, exploiting the very structure of domestic service. Every meal she served was both an act of obedience and, possibly, an act of rebellion. Every dish might have carried the weight of history, the centuries of exploitation distilled into one spoonful of poison. To the family, she was a fixture, someone who had always been there and always would be. But from her perspective, she may have felt like a ghost haunting the house, present but unseen, carrying silent rage. And in a society where justice for the oppressed was a fantasy, perhaps she created her own form of justice, slow, quiet, and devastating. This was not just a household. It was a microcosm of Alabama itself. A family clinging to power and reputation while rotting from within, and a servant whose outward submission masked a growing determination to upend that world entirely. The South was rebuilding its roads, its schools, its laws, but beneath the surface of progress lay wounds that refused to heal. In that context, the housemaid's alleged campaign of poison feels less like random cruelty and more like the dark echo of history itself, a personal rebellion hidden within daily routine. As neighbors watched the family's misfortunes pile up, another son struck down, another daughter bedridden, rumors began to stir. People wondered why tragedy seemed to circle this one household like a vulture. Some muttered about a family curse. Others whispered of bad blood, of sins that demanded payment. But in the servants' quarters, where truth and rumor often mingled, the story took shape. Someone inside the house was pulling the strings. Someone who was always there, always overlooked, was quietly unraveling the family from within. The gilded columns and polished silver could not protect against what was happening in the kitchen. And in that contrast lies the core of this story: wealth and power on one side, servitude and silence on the other. One presented itself as untouchable, but the other had learned how to strike without ever being seen. The first deaths seemed unremarkable, at least by the standards of the time. In an era when medicine was crude and epidemics swept through towns without mercy, sudden sickness was almost expected. Fevers rose without warning, stomach illnesses carried people off in days, and the death of a young adult was often met with resigned sorrow rather than shock. But in one Alabama household, the rhythm of grief was too steady, too consistent, to ignore. One by one, members of the family fell. Each illness followed a strangely similar pattern, and yet, no one could quite put the pieces together. It began, according to the whispers, with the patriarch, the proud head of the family who had survived the Civil War and held the estate together in its aftermath. He was a man used to power, accustomed to respect, and known for his rigid control over his household. When he first complained of stomach pains, no one imagined danger. Perhaps it was a bad meal, perhaps indigestion from too much brandy. But within days, he was bedridden, feverish, and racked with convulsions. Doctors were called, but their diagnoses were vague. Some said it was dysentery. Others muttered about a fever brought on by contaminated water. Within a week, he was gone, buried in the family plot under the magnolias. The household mourned, but life carried on. The widow took control, the children tried to adjust, and the housemaid, the silent figure in the background, remained at her post, preparing meals, pouring coffee, and serving dinner, as always. To the grieving family, her presence must have felt comforting, a thread of stability in a world that seemed suddenly uncertain. But stability was not what lay ahead. Months later, another illness struck. This time it was one of the sons, barely in his 20s, healthy and strong. His decline mirrored his father's: sudden cramps, waves of nausea, bouts of violent vomiting. Again, the doctor came. Again, the diagnosis was inconclusive. He too was laid to rest in the family graveyard. Whispers began to rise in the community. What misfortune haunted this house? What illness seemed to stalk only its residents? Then it was the matriarch herself, a woman of refined manners. She prided herself on keeping up appearances, but appearances could not shield her from the same fate. Her decline was slower, stretching over weeks, marked by weakness, pale skin, and a growing inability to eat. Servants brought trays of soup and tea to her bedside. The housemaid, always attentive, spoon-fed her broth, adjusted her pillows, and whispered reassurances. To anyone watching, she was the picture of loyalty, a devoted servant caring for her mistress. Yet behind those small acts of kindness, some believe, lurked the steady hand of a poisoner. By now, patterns should have raised alarms. But the 19th century was a world without forensic science, without toxicology reports, without the ability to test for the subtle, grainy crystals of rat poison. The symptoms mimicked so many other common illnesses that suspicion rarely fell on foul play. Families trusted their doctors, who in turn often blamed bad air, tainted wells, or simple misfortune. And so the deaths continued, cloaked in the language of natural causes. The housemaid knew this. Whether through observation, through whispers in her community, or through her own cunning, she understood the perfect weapon had been placed in her hands. Rat poison was everywhere, in pantries, in barns, in storerooms. It was meant for vermin, but in measured doses, it worked its cruel magic on humans just the same. A pinch stirred into coffee, a sprinkle mixed into cornbread, a trace added to stew. It was almost undetectable. Its effects were not immediate, but stretched over time, allowing sickness to seem natural. This was not a crime of passion. This was a crime of patience. Neighbors began to talk. Deaths that might have seemed normal in isolation began to form a sinister pattern when viewed together. The family was shrinking rapidly, its members struck down in their prime. Some whispered of a curse, punishment from God, perhaps, for sins of the past. Others speculated about a family weakness, a sickness in the blood that doomed them all. Few dared to suggest what some must have suspected, that someone inside the house was feeding the sickness directly into their meals. For the survivors, the terror must have been unbearable. Imagine sitting down to supper, the table laid with roasted meats, fresh bread, and steaming vegetables, while grief still lingered from the last burial. Imagine lifting a spoon to your mouth and wondering if this meal would be your last. Every bite carried the taste of dread, but manners demanded they eat. Trust demanded they believe the food was safe. And the housemaid, hovering quietly at the edge of the room, refilling glasses and clearing plates, gave them no reason to doubt her. She had perfected invisibility. To the family, she was as ordinary as the chairs they sat on, part of the background of their daily lives. Yet invisibility was her weapon. She was present at every meal, every illness, every death, without ever attracting suspicion. And as the graveyard filled, she remained the one constant presence, the living shadow in a house of the dying. What is most chilling is how the deaths blurred together, until grief itself became routine. Another coughing fit, another pale face, another casket carried down the garden path. The townsfolk grew uneasy, but the family clung to explanations that felt safe. Illness was tragic but understandable. Poison, on the other hand, would have meant betrayal from within their own walls. And perhaps that thought was too horrifying to confront. The first deaths were silent lessons. Each one taught the housemaid how far she could go, how much suspicion she could avoid, how easily grief disguised her hand. Each funeral paved the way for the next. With every lowered coffin, she grew bolder, more certain that no one would ever look her way. She had found the perfect disguise, loyalty itself. As the years passed, the pattern of death no longer looked like chance. It looked like destiny. The family's name, once a mark of prestige in Alabama society, began to sound cursed. Where other households passed heirlooms and land down to children and grandchildren, this one passed only coffins and whispered condolences. Generation after generation, the family line thinned, until it seemed there would be no one left to inherit the great estate. Each new heir came into the house believing they could restore what had been lost. Young men, proud and confident, returned from schools in the north or from newly acquired business ventures, only to collapse into fever and agony within months of settling in. Daughters married into neighboring families, their beauty and dowries promising fresh hope, but their stays in the house were short-lived. They too fell into the cycle. First stomach cramps, then nausea, then violent illness that no medicine could cure. Their weddings gave way to funerals, and their futures became footnotes carved in stone at the family cemetery. The housemaid was always there. She saw the new faces arrive, watched the optimism of youth light up the mansion, and then observed quietly as sickness stripped it all away. To some, she may have seemed a fixture, a piece of furniture as permanent as the grand piano in the parlor or the portraits on the walls. But in truth, she was the only constant that survived the family's unraveling. Each generation trusted her, just as the last had, and each one paid the same price. By now, it was no longer a string of tragedies. It was a legend in the making. Neighbors spoke of it with dread. Some crossed themselves when they passed the estate, muttering prayers as though warding off evil. They told stories of a curse laid upon the family, of dark sins from the past demanding repayment in blood. A few dared to whisper what others feared to say aloud, that the curse had a face, and that it belonged to the silent woman in the kitchen. Yet suspicion was never proof. Poison leaves no mark the eye can see, no wound that points to a killer's hand. And in a world where medicine was still fumbling in the dark, sickness was easier to accept than betrayal. The family's money paid for doctors, but their diagnoses remained vague. Consumption, fever, flux, colic. Their science was little more than guesswork. Every burial was written off as misfortune. And through it all, the housemaid kept her place, dutiful, quiet, unshaken. Imagine the effect this must have had on the survivors. Each new generation must have felt like they were living in a house haunted not by ghosts, but by inevitability. The dining table became a stage for silent dread. Every time a spoon clinked against porcelain, every time a glass was raised to drink, there must have been a shadow of fear. They prayed over meals, perhaps, but the prayers did nothing to slow the pattern. The sickness always came, as steady as the seasons. It is tempting to think of her as a mere villain, cold, calculating, delighting in the suffering she caused. And perhaps she was. But another possibility is far more unsettling, that she saw herself not as a murderer, but as an agent of justice. For generations, Southern households had thrived on the labor of women like her, women who were invisible except for the work they performed. Their pain went unnoticed, their humanity denied. Maybe, to her, each pinch of poison was repayment for decades of humiliation and cruelty. Perhaps she believed she was balancing the scales of history, one meal at a time. Her choice of poison itself supports this theory. Unlike a knife or a gun, poison is not about sudden violence. It is about patience, control, and inevitability. It forces the victim to suffer slowly, to feel their strength drain away while still clinging to hope. It allows the poisoner to watch life fade, not in a moment of chaos, but in a drawn-out surrender. To use poison is to play God in miniature, deciding not just that someone should die, but how long their suffering should last. By the third or fourth wave of deaths, it must have seemed as if the house itself was complicit. The once grand estate, with its bright windows and towering columns, became a place of dread. Its halls were filled with mourning clothes, its parlor with the scent of lilies from endless funerals. Neighbors visited less and less, not wanting to risk the curse that hung over the family. The laughter of children disappeared from its rooms, replaced by silence. The portraits on the walls seemed to stare down in judgment as each new coffin passed through the door. Some said the housemaid moved like a shadow through these tragedies, her face unreadable, her demeanor unchanged. Others recalled glimpses of something more unsettling, a faint smile at a funeral, a steady gaze during a doctor's visit, a silence that felt heavy with secrets. These could have been embellishments, the inventions of gossip eager to give the legend teeth. But even as myth, they reveal how the community viewed her, not just as a servant, but as a figure of fear. And yet, she was never caught, never accused in a court of law, never dragged into the spotlight as a murderer. Her power lay in her invisibility, in the trust that came from her station. Families entrusted her with their children, their meals, their very survival. And she used that trust, if the whispers are true, to erase the very people who believed they commanded her. By the end, there were no heirs left. The family line, once proud and sprawling, was gone. The estate stood like a monument to failure, its halls echoing with memories but empty of life. The housemaid, in her own way, had achieved what war, famine, and poverty could not. She had extinguished a dynasty. Whether she did it out of hatred, vengeance, or some dark compulsion, her campaign of poison was absolute. This is where the story takes on the texture of myth. To some, she became a warning, a symbol of why the wealthy should never grow too comfortable in their privilege. To others, she was a monster, proof that evil can wear the face of loyalty. And in the blurred line between history and folklore, she was both, a servant and a destroyer, a woman and a curse. To understand the terror of this story, we must step away from the mansion and look into the mind of the woman at its center, the silent housemaid who may have orchestrated an entire family's destruction. Poison, after all, is not just a weapon. It is a window into psychology. It tells us not only how someone kills, but why. Historians and criminologists have long noted that poison is the preferred tool of killers who value control, patience, and invisibility. Unlike the sudden violence of a knife or the chaos of a gunshot, poison requires careful planning. It is not impulsive, it is deliberate. Every act of poisoning involves foresight, measuring the dose, disguising it in food or drink, waiting to see how the body responds. It is not the crime of someone who wishes to be seen. It is the crime of someone who thrives in being unseen. Female poisoners, in particular, have haunted history. In Europe, there was Julia Tofana, who in the 17th century supplied women with inheritance powders to rid themselves of abusive husbands. In America, there were women like Lydia Sherman, who fed arsenic to multiple husbands and children in the 19th century. Poison gave women in powerless positions a terrifying kind of agency. It allowed them to kill without brute strength, to dominate without open confrontation. For many, it was the only weapon available. And in the case of our Alabama housemaid, it was the perfect mask. Was she driven by rage? Or was her motive something colder, more detached? To poison generation after generation requires not just anger, but persistence. It is possible she carried within her the kind of resentment that simmers over years, fed by every insult, every humiliation, every reminder of her status as less than human. She may have been forced to bow, to smile, to serve, all while her soul burned with a quiet fury. If so, the act of slipping poison into a meal was not only about killing an individual. It was about reclaiming power in a world that had denied her any. But there is another possibility, one more unsettling. Perhaps she felt nothing at all. Some poisoners kill not out of revenge, but out of cold curiosity, or the thrill of knowing they control life and death. For them, watching the slow unraveling of the human body becomes its own dark fascination. The sickness of their victim is not tragedy, it is proof of their mastery. Invisibility itself becomes intoxicating, because it means they can strike again and again without consequence. If this was her psychology, then the Alabama housemaid may not have been enacting justice. She may simply have been addicted to the act of killing itself. The psychological profile of poisoners often reveals traits of meticulousness. They are planners, observers, strategists. They understand the rhythms of those around them. When meals are taken, who eats what, who prefers tea over coffee. They study their victims in ways that make them seem almost empathetic, but it is empathy corrupted into calculation. The housemaid would have known which family member was most vulnerable, which ones trusted her most, which ones never questioned her hand. Each death would have been tailored to the person, disguised by the routines of daily life. And yet, poisoners are rarely monsters in appearance. They are often described as quiet, polite, even nurturing. That was her disguise as well. She was the caregiver, the one who wiped fevered brows and spoon-fed broth into trembling mouths. Victims, if they ever suspected, likely dismissed the thought because the killer's face was the face of comfort. This duality, caretaker and executioner, is what makes poisoners so terrifying. They do not just kill their victims, they betray the deepest bonds of trust. In the case of the Alabama maid, this betrayal was layered with history. She did not simply serve one master. She served multiple generations. Each new heir inherited not just land and wealth, but also her presence in the household. Imagine the psychology of that. To see the children of those who may have mistreated her, to watch them grow into adults who would carry forward the same entitlement, the same assumptions of superiority. For her, perhaps, killing was not about individuals. It was about cutting down the tree itself, root and branch, so that nothing could grow from it again. The legend surrounding her paints her as patient, almost supernatural, as if she were less a woman and more a curse. And perhaps that is how she saw herself. Some killers develop a kind of myth in their own minds, believing they are instruments of destiny. They do not see themselves as criminals, but as forces of nature, executing justice that the world refuses to deliver. If this was her belief, then every pinch of poison was not merely murder. It was judgment, a ritual meant to erase an entire bloodline. But folklore also allows for another interpretation. Perhaps the housemaid was not a killer at all, but a scapegoat. In a world where black servants were rarely defended, suspicion could easily fall on her whenever misfortune struck. The repeated illnesses may have been coincidence, or the result of poor sanitation, contaminated wells, or hereditary disease. And yet, the legend grew around her because she fit the role that society feared most, the invisible servant who might one day strike back. This tension between reality and myth is what keeps her story alive. If she truly poisoned the family, then she was one of the most patient, relentless killers in American history, erasing a dynasty without ever being caught. If she did not, then the legend itself reveals more about the South than about her. A story born from guilt, fear, and the knowledge that centuries of oppression might someday demand retribution. Either way, the psychology is chilling. Whether she was a cold-blooded poisoner or an innocent woman turned into a monster by rumor, the image remains the same. A figure standing quietly at the edge of the dining room, pouring wine or clearing plates, her face unreadable, her hands steady. To the family, she was a servant. To history, she is a question mark. And to us, she is the embodiment of one of humanity's darkest fears, that the person we trust most may be the one patiently plotting our end. In most true crime stories, there is a moment of reckoning, a confession wrung out under questioning, a trial that grips the public, or a hanging that serves as a grim finale. But in the case of the Alabama housemaid, there is no record of justice. No trial transcript, no headlines splashed across the newspapers, no gallows built for her final walk. Instead, what we are left with is silence, an erasure that is almost as haunting as the crimes themselves. The deaths continued until the family line itself was broken, yet no one was formally accused. Doctors wrote causes of death that sounded reasonable for the time: fever, dysentery, cholera, consumption. Priests gave last rites. Neighbors delivered casseroles and condolences. The community mourned the loss of yet another son, daughter, or mother, but their grief was always wrapped in the language of fate. Death, after all, was everywhere in the 19th century South. To lose children, to lose spouses, it was expected, however painful. Perhaps that expectation provided the perfect cover. If there were whispers of poison, they never hardened into evidence. The very idea was almost unthinkable. A servant accused of killing not just one master, but generations of them, would have been seen as something monstrous, almost supernatural. And perhaps that was part of the reason her story slipped into folklore instead of history. To admit her guilt would have required admitting that a black woman, considered powerless in her society, had outwitted and outlasted an entire white dynasty. That possibility was more terrifying than any ghost story. Instead, her legend lived in the shadows, passed down in whispers, half believed and half denied. Families in neighboring towns told their children not to trust every smiling face. Rumors spread that the housemaid had never been caught because she simply disappeared one day, fading back into the black community with no one daring to follow. Others insisted she remained in the house until the end, still serving, still cooking, as if she had woven herself so deeply into the family that even suspicion could not separate her. There are stories, too, that the house was left abandoned, its halls echoing with memories of sickness and grief. Some said the walls themselves held the poison, that no one dared live there afterward for fear of the curse. Visitors claimed to see her figure in the windows, moving from room to room, long after the last family member was buried. Whether she died quietly in her bed or vanished into history, no one can say. What survives are only fragments, oral traditions, scattered newspaper clippings that hint at tragedy but never name her, and the uneasy knowledge that something terrible once unfolded behind those white columns. This absence of record raises unsettling questions. Was the truth deliberately erased? Was it easier for the community to accept a story of bad luck, of God's will, than to face the reality of calculated murder? Or did the family themselves choose silence, unwilling to stain their name with the scandal of betrayal from within? Wealthy families often controlled what was said about them, ensuring their reputations remained untarnished even in ruin. It is possible that the story of the housemaid was kept off the record intentionally, allowed to fester only in rumor so that it would never become official history. But erasure does not mean disappearance. Legends often outlive facts, and in this case, the legend may be more powerful. It forces us to confront the gaps in our history, the stories of servants, women, and people of color whose lives and crimes were rarely written down unless filtered through the pens of the powerful. The Alabama housemaid may have been one of the deadliest poisoners in American history, but because of who she was, her story was never given the dignity, or the infamy, of record. She existed in the margins, where truth and myth become indistinguishable. And perhaps that is why her story haunts us still. Because we do not know how it ended, we are left to imagine it ourselves. Did she slip quietly into old age, her hands still steady as she stirred pots of stew for a new household that never suspected her past? Did she confess on her deathbed, unburdening her soul before a stunned priest? Or did she carry her secret with her to the grave, leaving only silence behind? The fact that we cannot answer these questions is what makes the legend so enduring. Every time the tale is told, it shifts slightly, reshaped by the teller. In some versions, she is a righteous avenger, punishing generations of oppressors with a weapon so simple it was hiding in plain sight. In others, she is a cold-blooded killer, a woman whose heart was as merciless as her patience. The truth is likely more complex, tangled in the realities of her time and the limits of what was recorded. But the silence of the historical record is itself a kind of verdict, a reminder that some of the darkest stories are the ones deliberately buried. The story of the Alabama housemaid does not end with her, nor with the family she erased. It lingers like a poison in the imagination, a legacy that survives in whispers and folklore long after the graves have settled. What remains is not just the tale of a woman who may have killed, but a reflection of an entire society, a society that built its identity on hierarchy, silence, and denial. For the families who lived nearby, the legend became a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children about trusting too easily, about the dangers that lurked in familiar faces. Ministers folded the story into sermons about sin and divine punishment, suggesting that perhaps the deaths were not the work of a maid but the wrath of God upon a family guilty of arrogance and cruelty. Others spoke of her as a curse made flesh, a spirit of vengeance walking the earth to collect debts unpaid by history. The tale blurred the line between fact and myth until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. What makes this story so powerful is not simply the horror of the deaths, but the symbolism they carry. A single woman, supposedly powerless in the eyes of her society, may have toppled an entire dynasty not through rebellion or open violence, but through patience, silence, and the simplest of tools. In a South where Black voices were suppressed and women's power was denied, the idea that someone from both groups could dismantle a legacy of privilege is as shocking now as it must have been then. That is why her legend endured. It embodies both the terror and the justice that haunted the post-war South. But we must also confront the uncomfortable truth. We do not know if she was guilty. Her name is absent from records, her voice erased from history, her motives never captured in writing. She may have been a monster hiding in plain sight, or she may have been an innocent woman turned into a specter of fear by a community desperate for explanations. In either case, the legend tells us as much about Alabama society as it does about her. It reveals the anxieties of a world built on fragile power, where the privileged feared that one day the people who served them might rise up, not with weapons, but with something far subtler and far deadlier. The image of her standing in the dining room, quiet, unremarkable, unseen, has become a metaphor for hidden danger. It reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with violence or spectacle. Sometimes it waits patiently, moving spoonful by spoonful, meal by meal, until it has undone everything its victims believed was unshakable. That is why poison is such a terrifying weapon. It transforms trust itself into a trap. Today, her story survives as folklore, but also as a kind of unfinished history. It forces us to ask why some stories are remembered and others erased. How many women like her, servants, marginalized, invisible, moved through history leaving traces that were never recorded? How many families buried their dead without ever realizing the quiet rebellion unfolding under their roof? How many killers lived and died in silence because society refused to look too closely? The legacy of the Alabama housemaid is not just about death. It is about memory, what we choose to remember, what we allow to be forgotten, and what refuses to die even when written records are silent. Her tale exists in that uneasy space between justice and injustice, between horror and fascination. If she was guilty, she executed one of the most patient, devastating acts of vengeance in American history. If she was innocent, then her legend is its own kind of crime, an accusation born from prejudice that condemned her in whispers instead of facts. And so we are left with the shadow of a woman whose face we cannot see, whose name we do not know, whose motives remain locked in the grave. Was she a murderer or a myth? A curse or a victim? The answer lies forever out of reach. But perhaps that is why the story endures, because it forces us to sit with the unknown, with the possibility that history's darkest truths are not written in books, but carried in rumors, passed down in fear, and remembered in silence. In the end, the Alabama housemaid represents the deepest anxieties of the human heart. She is the reminder that power can be inverted, that trust can be fatal, and that the past never truly lets go. Her legacy is not in the death she caused, or was said to cause, but in the way we still speak her story today. And as long as her tale is told, she will never be gone. She will remain in the shadows of Southern memory, the silent figure at the table, waiting,